Hi, I'm Dave DeWitt, and today I'd like to address the question, should Christians keep the Mosaic Law? The definition I'm using is simple. The Mosaic Law is the law given to Moses. There are four basic views about the question, should Christians keep the Mosaic Law? I'll list them in what seems to me to be from the least or worst to the most or best biblically based positions. In other words, I hold the fourth position. So position number one says the Mosaic Law should be kept by all Christians today. This is the position of what are usually called the Hebrew Roots Ministries, the HRMs. Position number one, the biggest problem I would say is that no major Bible teacher has taught this in 2,000 years of church history. It's certainly possible for those studying the Bible to discover biblical truth which others before them have not found. The mega example is the Reformation of the 1500s. But those who have shaped biblical theology over the years have two things in common, which are lacking in those who say all Christians should keep the Mosaic Law. First of all, men who have developed our theology, like Augustine, Athanasius, Aquinas, Luther, Calvin, Edwards, and Darby, represent a greater focus on the Bible over and against those who have ignored the Bible, such as the Roman Catholic Church of the Middle Ages. HRMs, Hebrew Roots Ministries, are doing just the opposite, contradicting those who have focused on the Bible. And second, when a good theologian discovers a new, true biblical concept, a significant amount of Bible teachers across the church will see the new position as biblically consistent. This is not the case with the Hebrew Roots Ministries. Another significant problem with this position is that many of the 613 commandments which make up the Mosaic Law cannot be kept today. The Hebrew Roots Ministries are forced to be selective in their law keeping. Obedience to Mosaic law is impossible outside the physical land of Israel. Consider the following list. Do they keep or obey these commands? Remember, they cannot just say we should apply them. We should all apply them. But for example, one might apply the Sabbath command by resting any day of the week. So if the HRM's, Hebrew Roots Ministries, are keeping the Mosaic Law as a directive and saying every Christian should do that, then they must specifically perform these commands. I'll just list a few of them. Exodus 21:17. He who curses his father or mother shall be put to death. Leviticus 19:19. You shall not breed together two kinds of cattle. You shall not sow your field with two kinds of seed, nor wear a garment upon you with two kinds of material mixed together. Leviticus 19:27. You shall not round off the side growth of your head, nor harm the edges of your beard. Leviticus 20:13, if a man who lies with a male as those who lie with a female, both of them have committed a detestable act, and they shall be put to death. Leviticus 25:10 and 11, you shall thus consecrate the 50th year. It shall be a jubilee year for you. Each of you shall return to his own property, and each of you shall return to his family. You shall not sow or reap or aftergrowth, nor gather in from its untrimmed vines. In Deuteronomy 21:18-21, if any man is a stubborn or rebellious son who will not obey his father or mother, all the men of the city shall stone him to death. So the question is, would these be directives for the church today? So let's go to position number two. Position number two is the position of the Seventh-day Adventists. The Ten Commandments are eternal and should be kept, but the rest of the law was temporary. So the problems with position number two. Well, Jesus did not single out the Ten Commandments as being eternal. When he was asked which is the greatest command of the law, instead of quoting or referring to the Ten Commandments, Jesus said, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the great and foremost commandment. And the second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. That's from Matthew 22:35-39. This is a reference to Deuteronomy 6:5 and Leviticus 19:18, not to the Ten Commandments. Keeping the fourth commandment, the keeping the Sabbath, today is fraught with problems. Exodus 16:29 commands, "Remain every man in his place, let no one go out of his place on the seventh day." A Sabbath day's journey is defined by Luke in Acts 1:12 as from Jerusalem to the Mount of Olives, which is a little over a half a mile, about a kilometer. So anyone driving more than that, more than say 1 kilometer or half mile to get to church or synagogue, is violating the Sabbath. Another violation of the Sabbath is all the work we have to do to get to church, especially mothers who get their children ready and those who perform duties during the meetings, like the pastors. Then there's the violation of the Sabbath by turning on lights, heating, air conditioning, or other electronic equipment. Do they heat, air condition their homes on Saturday? The weekly Sabbath for Israel was about physical rest, not about worshiping or going to a meeting. At the time when Moses received the Ten Commandments, the Jews had no community meeting places. If keeping the Sabbath meant gathering on Saturday, why did Paul not reprimand the church in Troas for gathering on the first day of the week in Acts 20, verse 7? Actually participated in the gathering on Sunday. In the Jerusalem Council, recorded in Acts 15, the elders and the apostles gave 4 directives for Gentile Christians: keep from idols, fornication, blood, and things strangled. They made no mention of Sabbath keeping, but rather determined to lay on, quote, lay on you no greater burden than these essentials. So apparently Sabbath keeping is not an essential. Now position number 3. Moral and civil laws should be kept today, but not the ceremonial laws. This is the position of the covenant communities, such as the Reformed Presbyterians and the Lutherans. Let me read it again. The moral and civil laws should be kept today, but not the ceremonial laws. The case for keeping Sunday instead of Saturday as the Lord's Day has 4 arguments. Number 1, since Jesus was raised from the dead on the first day of the week, it's appropriate for Christians to worship on Sunday rather than Saturday. Number 2, the reference written by Luke in Acts 20, verse 7, is that they met on the first day of the week. The third argument comes from 1 Corinthians 16:2, where Paul wrote, on the first day of the week, let each of you put aside and save, that he may, as he may prosper, so that no collection be made when I came. This was a giving activity on Sunday. And number 4, Revelation 1:10 says, the Apostle John introduced his revelation by saying, I was in the Spirit on the Lord's Day. Since he did not say the Sabbath day, it's assumed that he was talking about Sunday. R.C. Sproul wrote this. This is a quote. John Calvin argued that it would be legitimate to have the Sabbath day on any day at all if the churches would agree, because the principle in view was the regular assembling of the saints for corporate worship or for observation of rest. That's a close quote. So for Calvin, any day was okay as long as the churches agreed to meet on that day. Now the problem with position number 3, Calvin's whole case is based on dividing the Mosaic Law into 3 parts: moral, civil, and ceremonial, then eliminating the ceremonial. But there's no such division in the Bible. Actually, James seems to connect all parts of the law together when he said, anyone who stumbles in one point has become guilty of all in James 2:10. Also, the case for Sunday keeping as a Sabbath is unconvincing. It's good to honor the fact that Jesus rose from the dead on the first day of the week, but there's no command from Christ or the apostles that would indicate the church was instructed to remember that by having a meeting or resting on Sunday. Second, the meeting of the church in Troas, described in Acts 26:12, is just an example of what one church did. There's no command or implication that all churches did that or were supposed to do that. The church in Jerusalem met every day of the week in Acts 2. Jesus and Paul were single and celibate. Does that mean we should all be single and celibate? Examples are not commands. Third, 1 Corinthians 16 is Paul's request for each one of you believers to put aside and save some money on the first day of the week. Paul's making a collection from the believers of Macedonia and Achaia to help the poor believers in Jerusalem. He was asking them to take some of their salary and set it aside weekly so that no collections be made when I come. There's no reference here to a meeting of a church. Number 4, there's no evidence that the Lord's Day in Revelation 1:10 is Sunday. E.W. Bullinger's commentary on Revelation explains, quote, "There is no evidence of any kind that the first day of the week was ever called the Lord's Day before the Apocalypse was written." He wrote this earlier. In the New Testament, this day always is called the first day of the week. It's never called Sunday. It's always called the first day of the week. It's never called the Lord's Day. So there's no evidence that the first day of the week was ever the Lord's Day before the Apocalypse. Well, all right, you have to bring Sunday to the verse to get Sunday out of it. John could just as well be referring to Saturday, Sabbath. Isaiah called the Sabbath day the day of the Lord, and that was, of course, Saturday. Also, if we look at it in the context of prophecy, the book of Revelation, it could be referring to the Old Testament prophetic day of the Lord. That's the time beginning with the future tribulation. At any rate, nothing says that the day of the Lord is Sunday. The fourth position, the Mosaic Law as a directive ended at the cross, but it should be applied like all Scripture. And as I mentioned, this is a position that I prefer. It's the position of the literal Bible community, such as the Baptists and the Brethren and the Pentecostals. It's also promoted by many modern Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox writers. The position is all Scripture should be applied today, 2 Timothy 3:16, but a prominent theme of the New Testament is that the Mosaic Law is not mandated as a directive for the church. Actually, the Mosaic Law should not be mandated for much of the Old Testament either. The Mosaic Law was not given until the 1500s BC. Adam, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, and Moses for the first 80 years of his life were part of the Torah, but they were not under the Mosaic Law. When God spoke with Moses about the Sabbath on Mount Sinai, he specified the sons of Israel shall observe the Sabbath to celebrate the Sabbath. It's a sign between me and the sons of Israel forever, he says in Exodus 31. Christ and the apostles grew up and lived under Judaism, so they did Jewish things, not just Mosaic Law things. Going to synagogues on the Sabbath was not part of the Mosaic Law. Actually, Jesus seemed to strengthen the other commands you have heard, but I say to you, and weakened the Sabbath. For example, in the Old Testament Israel, when a man was found gathering wood on the Sabbath day, the Lord said to Moses, he shall be put to death. So the congregation stoned him to death. But Jesus defended his disciples for picking grain, rubbing it with their hands and removing the chaff, and then eating the grain on the Sabbath. It's hard to specify a difference between the mechanical act of gathering wood on the Sabbath and the mechanical act of gathering, rubbing off the chaff, and eating the grain on the Sabbath. Jesus said things like, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, and is it lawful to do good or harm on the Sabbath? And the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. And the Sabbath day is referring to part of the Mosaic Law, not the Pharisaic traditions. Paul and Barnabas went on the first missionary journey to Galatia. After that, Paul wrote to them about some Judaizers who were telling them to keep the Mosaic Law. Paul calls it a different gospel in Galatians 1:6. Paul added, if righteousness comes through the law, then Christ died needlessly in Galatians 2:21. And Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law. Paul drove home his point about the end of the Mosaic Law in Galatians 3:24 and 25. He said, quote, therefore, the law has become our tutor to lead us to Christ so that we may be justified by faith. But now that faith has come, we're no longer under a tutor. The principle is one person regards one day above another regards every day alike. Each person must be fully convinced in his own mind. Well, as a conclusion, the verse I always think of when this subject comes up is Romans 10:4. Christ is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone who believes. The Mosaic Law was given as a directive from God to Moses to be delivered to the 12 tribes of Israel. It was between God and Israel. But since we have it as inspired scripture, we should apply it today as something that tells us about the mind of God. When Jesus was asked which is the greatest command of the law, he didn't give the 10 commandments. Jesus summarized the Mosaic Law saying, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the great and foremost commandment, and the second is like it, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Well, thanks for listening. My paper on the subject with footnotes and references is available on our website, relationalconcepts.org.